There are places in American history where the lines between man, myth, and monster dissolve completely, but few names bring that division to ash like Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, better known as H.H. Holmes, the charming physician, the fraudulent entrepreneur, the pathological con artist, and the architect of one of the most disturbing structures ever built, a Chicago building that newspapers later called the Murder Castle. His crimes were real, and so were his victims. And if the testimonies that followed are to be believed, so were the things that lingered after him. Some claimed to hear footsteps in sealed halls. Others swore Holmes himself returned long after the noose broke his neck. In this video, we will cover the life and crimes of H.H. Holmes, as well as the horrific darkness that followed even long after he was gone. I am joined on this journey of telling this harrowing story by my good friend, the Tape Library, so please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to us both. Now, let us begin. Herman Webster Mudgett, later known as H.H. Holmes, was born May 16th of 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He was the third of 4 children of Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, a farming family descended from early English settlers. By most accounts, young Herman was an intelligent but somewhat odd child who excelled in school. This led to bullying by his classmates, who targeted him for his studious nature and peculiar demeanor. One famous anecdote describes how older bullies dragged him to a doctor's office and forced him to confront a real human skeleton, pressing the skeleton's hands onto his face. Initially terrified, Herman later claimed this incident sparked a morbid fascination rather than fear. He became intrigued by the anatomy displayed and felt that it helped him overcome his fears. Thereafter, he developed an obsession with death and began dissecting animals in his adolescence. Researchers have noted that Holmes's childhood showed several common serial killer precursors: social isolation, animal cruelty, and exposure to trauma. In his own recollections, he even hinted that at age 11, he might have caused the death of a friend, a boy named Tom, by pushing him from a height, although he claimed it was an accident at the time. Holmes was also raised in a strict rural household. Some later reports suggest his father was an alcoholic who disciplined the children harshly, though concrete evidence of severe abuse is sparse. What is clear is that Herman was bright. He graduated from high school at Gilmanton Academy at age 16 in 1877 and was described as exceptionally intelligent. On July 4, 1878, at only 17, he married Clara Lovering in Alton, New Hampshire. Clara was from a well-off family, and this early marriage may have been Holmes's first taste of using personal relationships for financial gain. A son, Robert Mudgett, was born in February of 1880. However, the marriage did not last long. Holmes left Clara behind within a few years. By 1884, she returned to New Hampshire, reportedly after suffering physical abuse from him. They never officially divorced. Holmes's later attempt to divorce her on the grounds of infidelity was dismissed. Ambitious and interested in medicine, Herman pursued higher education. He briefly attended the University of Vermont in 1879, but left after 1 year. In 1882, he enrolled in the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, where he would graduate in June of 1884 with a Doctor of Medicine degree. His academic performance at Michigan was reportedly mediocre, but he showed a particular interest in anatomy. Holmes worked in the anatomy lab under Professor William James Herdman, the chief anatomy instructor, and there were rumors that the pair facilitated body snatching to supply cadavers for the medical school. Holmes later admitted that during his medical training, he engaged in insurance fraud schemes using the cadavers. By his own account, he would steal corpses or obtain them from morgues, disfigure them, then plant the bodies to fake the death of fictitious people on whom he had taken out life insurance policies under aliases. Collecting the insurance payouts was lucrative, and it foreshadowed the elaborate scams he would conduct later. In fact, Holmes was briefly expelled from Michigan for grave robbing, according to some sources, but was readmitted and managed to graduate. This early exposure to death, dissection, and deceit during his formative years laid the groundwork for his future crimes. After receiving his medical degree, Herman Mudgett abandoned his wife and young son and roamed for new opportunities and victims. In the mid-1880s, he drifted through a series of jobs and used various aliases to stay ahead of creditors and investigators. By this time, he had become adept at fraud and had no qualms about reinventing his identity. In 1885, he was in Moores Forks, New York, where rumors spread that a local boy who had been seen with him had disappeared. Herman claimed the boy went back to Massachusetts, and no investigation ensued as he quickly skipped town. He next turned up in Philadelphia in 1885 or 1886, working as a drugstore clerk. While he was employed at a Philadelphia pharmacy, a child died after taking medicine purchased there. Herman, still known by his real name or another alias at the time, denied any involvement in the boy's death, but he left the city hastily after the incident. Sensing that the authorities or aggrieved families might catch up to him, he decided to completely change his identity. Before moving to Chicago in 1886, Herman Webster Mudgett assumed the alias that would make him infamous, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes for short. He chose the name Holmes quite possibly inspired by the Sherlock Holmes stories, which were then newly popular, to add a veneer of respectable intellect. Under this new name, he arrived in Chicago, Illinois in August of 1886. At that time, Chicago was a booming city, soon to host the 1893 World's Fair, and it offered the anonymity of a metropolis and a flood of strangers. Holmes settled in the Englewood neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. He quickly obtained a position as a pharmacist at a drugstore on West 63rd Street, owned by Dr. Elizabeth S. Holton. Contrary to legend, Dr. E.S. Holton was a woman, not an elderly man, and she and her husband survived Holmes. Holmes proved to be a charming and capable employee, and he eventually bought the drugstore from Mrs. Holton. Later folklore claimed Holmes murdered the Holtons and disposed of their bodies, but records show that the couple actually lived well into the 20th century, actually outliving Holmes. By 1887, as a successful young pharmacist, Dr. H.H. Holmes was a well-known figure in Englewood. Holmes's personal life in this period was as fraudulent as his professional one. He remained legally married to Clara Lovering, but in January 1887, he married Myrta Belknap in Minneapolis, introducing himself now as Henry H. Holmes. Myrta was 24 and from a wealthy Illinois family. Myrta and Holmes had a daughter named Lucy, born in July of 1889 in Chicago. For a time, Holmes actually lived with Myrta and baby Lucy in a Chicago suburb, presenting the image of a normal family man. But in reality, he was simultaneously courting other women and plotting bigamist marriages for financial gain. Holmes would eventually accumulate 3 or 4 wives in different cities, never bothering to legally divorce the earlier ones. His extraordinary charisma and lies persuaded many women to trust him with their money and their lives. Later, it came to light that Holmes often convinced lovers or employees to take out life insurance policies, naming him as the beneficiary, and many of those people would soon go missing. In 1887, H.H. Holmes made a fateful real estate purchase, a vacant lot across the street from his drugstore at the corner of 63rd Street and Wallace. Here, he set out to construct a building that would serve multiple purposes. It would be his business headquarters, his home, and a trap for his victims. Holmes personally designed the building and oversaw construction. The result was a strange 3-block-long structure with commercial storefronts on the ground floor, including a new drugstore, and apartments or hotel rooms on the upper floors. During construction, Holmes hired and fired multiple contractors frequently, so that no one architect or builder knew the blueprint of what he was creating. He was also chronically delinquent in payments. In one case, he refused to pay a steel company named Etna Iron and Steel, which led to a lawsuit in 1888. But Holmes had little intention of paying his bills, or of fully divulging the building's sinister design. By 1891, the structure was completed as a 2-story edifice dubbed Holmes Castle by locals, and Holmes moved his pharmacy and personal office into it. In 1892, he added a 3rd floor, telling investors and suppliers that he planned to operate it as a hotel for tourists during the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition, or World's Fair, in 1893. With Chicago expecting millions of visitors to the World's Fair, the World's Fair Hotel sounded like a golden investment opportunity, but it was largely a ruse to swindle suppliers and perhaps to lure victims. In reality, Holmes's hotel was never truly completed or open to the public in great numbers. Many of the furnishings were never paid for, and creditors frequently reclaimed goods from the premises. However, the lack of legitimate hotel business did not stop Holmes from using the castle for far darker private enterprises. During these Chicago years, Holmes also continued his pattern of fraud and crime outside of the castle. In 1893, he entered into a bigamous marriage with another woman by the name of Minnie Williams, under yet another alias. Minnie was a former Texas heiress whom Holmes had befriended, and he managed to swindle her out of valuable property, deeding a Fort Worth estate to a fake name which Holmes controlled. That same year, Holmes was involved in other various swindles, including selling bogus medicines and running up debts. By 1894, as authorities slowly started closing in on some of his scams, Holmes left Chicago to travel, with stops in Texas, Missouri, and beyond in search of new schemes. But it was the accumulated secrets of his murder castle in Inglewood that, once revealed, would secure his place in history as one of America's most notorious criminals.
Holmes's Englewood building soon gained a notorious reputation as the so-called Murder Castle, a name coined by the Yellow Press. The structure was an unnerving mix of legitimate business and hidden horrors. Contemporary newspapers, in the sensational style of the 1890s, described the castle as a labyrinthian death trap, designed by Holmes to lure in victims. According to these reports and later books, Holmes's building contained windowless rooms, secret passageways, false floors, doors that opened into brick walls, staircases leading nowhere, and a maze-like layout intended to confuse anyone inside. Many rooms were allegedly outfitted as soundproof chambers that Holmes could lock from the outside. There were also claims of special asphyxiation chambers, pipes connected to gas lines so that Holmes, from his own quarters, could turn a valve and silently fill a guest's room with lethal gas while they slept. In the basement, Holmes was said to have installed a crematorium, disguised as a normal furnace, to incinerate bodies, vats of acid and quicklime to dissolve corpses, and medical tables for the dissection of victims. In one lurid 1943 description by writer John Bartlow Martin, the cellar was perhaps the most remarkable section. Fitted with operating tables, a crematorium, pits containing quicklime and acids, surgical instruments, and various pieces of apparatus which, resembling medieval torture acts, never were satisfactorily explained. Supposedly, Holmes even had a stretching rack for horrific experiments and hired a needy articulator, an articulate skeleton seller, to help strip flesh from bodies and assemble skeletons for sale. These gruesome features, trapdoors, torture devices, secret chutes for dumping bodies, captured the public's imagination and earned the building its nickname as a house of horrors. However, later research has shown that many of these claims were exaggerated or outright myths, propagated by 19th century tabloids. The reality of Holmes's castle, while certainly sinister, was less likely fantastic than the legend. Modern historians like Adam Seltzer and Harold Schechter have noted that much of the murder castle lore came from an overly credulous press that printed wild allegations during Holmes's arrest and trial. For example, newspapers reported that the castle contained over 100 rooms and countless passageways of terror. But in truth, the completed portion was of modest size. The third floor was never fully finished or used as a hotel in any significant capacity. Blueprints and analysis indicate the building had some oddly constructed rooms and a few secret compartments, but these spaces likely served to hide stolen merchandise, furniture that Holmes had acquired on credit and never paid for, rather than to imprison victims. It is true that Holmes designed the second floor in a confusing way, probably to double-cross creditors and provide concealment. There was a walk-in vault built into the second floor, which Holmes used as an office safe, a room he could seal shut. This vault did figure in one of Holmes's murders, as an airtight chamber for suffocation, but the sensational claims of hinged walls, spring-loaded torture devices, or rooms literally built as gas chambers were not substantiated by physical evidence. When investigators finally examined the property in 1895, they did discover a few hidden closets, sealed rooms, a secret staircase, and the chute leading from the second floor to the basement, through which Holmes could slide bodies. The basement did contain a furnace, pits of quicklime, and bottles of chemicals, items which could be used for disposing of corpses. Police also found an array of surgical tools and charred remains, but much of the more elaborate torture palace narrative was likely the product of yellow journalism and Holmes's own embellishments. Holmes himself encouraged these ghastly tales at times, perhaps to inflate his infamy. Even so, the castle was undeniably the site of multiple murders, and the evil aura of the place has persisted in legend.
Holmes is often called America's first serial killer, though the true number of his murders remains uncertain. By the time of his arrest in 1894, people close to the investigation suspected him of at least 9 to 10 murders, and Holmes eventually confessed to 27 killings, a number inflated with lies. Some later estimates, fueled by tabloids and speculation, put the toll as high as 100 or even 200 victims, but there's no hard evidence for such figures. In fact, several people Holmes claimed to have murdered were still alive, casting doubt on many of his bragged kills. Modern scholarship generally recognizes 9 confirmed homicide victims attributable to Holmes, with several others strongly suspected. Most of these were individuals who either had something Holmes wanted, such as money or property, or who posed a threat to expose him, or hapless acquaintances drawn into his orbit. Unlike later serial killers driven purely by sadism or compulsion, Holmes's murders often had a practical motive: to eliminate business problems, secure insurance payouts, or ensure his own secrets remained hidden. That said, he also seemed to revel in deceit and had a callous disregard for life, which gave his crimes a terrifying casual nature. The first well-documented castle victims were Julia Smith, whose alias was Julia Connor, and her young daughter Pearl. Julia was the wife of a man who had worked in Holmes's building. She became Holmes's mistress after her husband left the job and moved away when he learned of the affair. Holmes let Julia and her 5-year-old daughter Pearl stay in the apartment in the castle, and on Christmas Eve 1891, the two mysteriously disappeared. Holmes gave varying explanations to those who asked, first saying that Julia had gone to visit out-of-town relatives, then that she had fled to avoid her estranged husband. But in reality, as Holmes later half confessed. Julia died during a botched abortion procedure that he had conducted on her. Holmes had some medical knowledge, but was not a skilled obstetrician. Mortality was high for such illicit abortions at the time, and Julia likely bled to death on Holmes's table. Holmes, then not wanting to care for her young child, then murdered little Pearl, presumably by poison or asphyxiation. When authorities eventually excavated the castle's cellar in 1895, they found the partial skeleton of the small child, buried in lime. Julia and Pearl Connor's deaths illustrate Holmes's cold opportunism. Julia had become inconvenient, and Holmes eliminated her and her child without remorse. Emiline Cigrand was a 23-year-old typist who worked for Holmes in mid-1892, ostensibly as his secretary after meeting her in Indiana. He charmed her with hints of marriage. For several months, she was seen in the castle, and Holmes even may have been engaged to her, but by December of 1892, Emiline disappeared suddenly as well. Holmes, again with his deceit, told people that Emiline had married a fictitious man named Robert Phelps and had moved away. But in cold truth, Emiline was likely murdered by Holmes when she started to grow distant or when he tired of her. Clues emerged later. A large trunk Emiline had purchased was found abandoned, and her friends doubted that she had left voluntarily. During the castle investigation, a witness named M.G. Chappelle came forward to admit that he had received a female skeleton from Holmes to articulate around that time. Police tracked that skeleton to a Chicago medical examiner's office, and it was very possible that it was Emiline's remains, sold for cash. Her disappearance is one of the confirmed murders tied to Holmes. He included her later in his confession. By early 1893, Holmes had ensnared another woman, one by the name of Vilhelmina Minnie Williams, a 24-year-old heiress from Texas who had come to Chicago. He had actually known Minnie years prior, meeting her in Boston under yet another one of his aliases. Holmes offered her a job and soon made her his lover. Crucially, he persuaded Minnie to sign over her property in Fort Worth, Texas, to an alias, Alexander Bond, which was one of Holmes's other personas. In April 1893, she did transfer the deed, which Holmes quickly reassigned to his associate, Benjamin Pitezel, under another alias, thereby stealing Minnie's estate out from underneath her. By May of 1893, Holmes and Minnie were presenting themselves as man and wife, and even rented a separate apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park together. Minnie's 18-year-old sister, Anna Nanny Williams, came to Chicago that summer at Holmes's invitation. The last known correspondence from Nanny was a letter sent to her aunt on July 5th of 1893, in which she gushed that Brother Harry, which was Holmes, would take care of her, and that she and her sister were set to go to Europe with him, assuring the family not to worry about her finances anymore. This eerie letter basically indicated that Holmes had gained Nanny's complete trust. After July of 1893, neither Minnie or Nanny Williams were ever seen alive again. Holmes later claimed that Minnie had killed Nanny in a fit of rage, and that he had killed Minnie in self-defense. A clear, far-fetched story, given that no evidence ever supported it. Several other additional disappearances in Chicago during this time period have also been linked to Holmes, although with varying certainty. Ironically, the murder that ultimately brought Holmes to justice was one he hadn't initially planned as a murder. Benjamin Pitezel was a 38-year-old carpenter and small-time crook who became Holmes's close accomplice and assistant. Pitezel had helped Holmes with various schemes, including constructing secret portions of the castle, and in 1894, Holmes and Pitezel concocted an elaborate insurance fraud. The idea was that Pitezel would fake his own death in Philadelphia so his wife could collect a $10,000 life insurance policy, after which they'd split the money with Holmes. Pitezel assumed an alias, B.F. Perry, and set up phony invention businesses in a rented house in Philadelphia. The plan was to stage a lab explosion and substitute a cadaver as Pitezel's body, but Holmes double-crossed his partner, and on September 2, 1894, Holmes knocked Pitezel unconscious with chloroform and then set his body on fire to make it look like an accident. Pitezel died from the combination of chloroform and his burns. Holmes then went about collecting the insurance payout. In a cruel twist, Holmes did not tell Mrs. Pitezel that her husband was truly dead. Instead, he lied that he was alive and in hiding, and that for the scam to work, she must not ask questions and must temporarily entrust 3 of her 5 children to him. Shockingly, the desperate mother agreed. In another heinous chapter of Holmes's saga, after killing their father, Holmes traveled with 3 of the Pitezel's children, Alice, who was 15, Nellie, who was 11 or 12, and Howard, who was 8, under the pretense of reuniting them with their father at a later date. Meanwhile, he had Mrs. Pitezel and her 2 youngest, an infant and a toddler, following a parallel route separately, all the while stringing her along with lies. Through October of 1894, Holmes led the Pitezel children on a convoluted journey through the Midwest and into Canada, using multiple assumed names for himself and the kids. They went from Philadelphia to Cincinnati, then to Indianapolis, then Detroit, and into Toronto, with Mrs. Pitezel always kept just a city or 2 behind, unaware that her children were so near. Holmes's strategy was diabolical. He likely intended to murder the children one by one, both to keep the insurance money for himself and to eliminate witnesses who could contradict his story to Mrs. Pitezel. In one city, little Alice even wrote in a letter to her mother, ominously, that Howard is not with us now. Indeed, Holmes had separated Howard, the boy, from his sisters first. On October 10th of 1894, while staying in a house in Irvington, Indiana, Holmes killed 8-year-old Howard Pitezel, likely by poison or strangulation, and then dismembered and burned the boy's body. Holmes then took the 2 girls, Alice and Nellie, across the border to Toronto, Canada, and there, around October 25th of 1894, he murdered both sisters. When the Pitezel children vanished, Holmes spun a tale to their mother that an associate, one of his aliases, had taken them to London to meet their father, further delaying her alarm. These horrific crimes might have gone undiscovered for longer if it was not for the persistence of Detective Frank Geyer of Philadelphia. In summer of 1895, as Holmes sat in jail on unrelated charges, Geyer was tasked with the grim job of finding the missing Pitezel children, by that time presumed dead. Geyer doggedly traced Holmes's trail, checking hotel logs, interviewing witnesses, and following the faint paper trail left by Holmes's aliases. In July of 1895, Geyer's search led him to the Toronto house previously rented by Holmes. There, with the help of Toronto police, he dug in the cellar and uncovered the decomposed remains of Alice and Nellie Pitezel. The discovery was confirmed when they found personal artifacts, including a toy Nana had described, and pieces of the girls' clothing stuffed in the chimney. Geyer then backtracked to Indianapolis, where further investigation of the Irvington address revealed Howard's charred remains in the chimney flue. The murder of the 3 children stands as the most cold-blooded and heartbreaking of Holmes's offenses, revealing the depths of his depravity. Even hardened detectives were shaken by the sheer cruelty. One newspaper called it one of the strangest stories of remorseless cruelty the continent has ever produced.
Holmes's arrest in November 1894 was initially for a relatively minor charge, insurance fraud and the Texas horse theft warrant. But suspicions quickly grew that he was responsible for multiple missing persons. Held in Philadelphia, Holmes thought he could outsmart the authorities. He continued to spin lies, at one point claiming that the 3 missing Pitezel children were safe in the custody of Minnie Williams in London. His confidence was bolstered by the fact that he had gotten away with so much already. However, once Detective Geyer discovered the bodies of the Pitezel girls in July 1895, and evidence of Howard's murder, the authorities had what they needed to charge Holmes with murder. In October 1895, H. Holmes was put on trial in Philadelphia for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, the only murder committed in Pennsylvania, which is why he was tried there first. The trial quickly became a national media sensation. The prosecution, led by District Attorney George S. Graham, methodically laid out the case that Holmes had killed Pitezel to fraudulently get the insurance money and then had also killed the 3 children. However, the judge ruled that the trial should focus only on the murder of the father, Benjamin, and not muddy the jury with the children's death, since they occurred in other jurisdictions. Even so, the implicit spectre of those crimes loomed over the proceedings. Holmes initially attempted to act as his own attorney, confident in his powers of persuasion. But when the trial opened on October 28, 1895, he ended up retaining his lawyers, who had tried to withdraw, seeing the case as hopeless. The evidence against Holmes was damning. Key witnesses took the stand. The carpenter who found Pitezel's body testified that Holmes had been seen at the scene and had keys to Pitezel's workspace. A chemist, Dr. Henry Leffman, presented forensic testimony that chloroform was found in Pitezel's stomach, but in a pattern indicating it was administered after death, supporting the theory that Holmes poisoned Pitezel's corpse to fake a suicide and fire accident. Holmes's defense had virtually nothing to counter with. They called no witnesses, and Holmes himself did not testify in his own defense for the murder charge. In truth, there was little he could say. The chain of circumstantial evidence was strong, and his credibility was shot. One dramatic moment came when Carrie Pitezel, the widow, took the stand. She recounted through tears how Holmes had manipulated her and taken away her children under false promises, all the while assuring her husband was alive abroad. The courtroom was stunned by her story. Another powerful moment was when Georgina Yoke, Holmes's latest wife, whom he had married in January 1894 in Denver, under yet another alias, while still married to Clara and Marta, testified for the prosecution. She provided an alibi that placed Holmes in Philadelphia at the time of Pitezel's death, and her presence also highlighted Holmes' pattern of lies. Their marriage was invalid, as he was a bigamist. Holmes was seen weeping in court when Georgina testified, but observers felt his tears were likely an act, crocodile tears to gain sympathy or sway his wife's emotions. The jury took only a short time, reportedly about 3 hours of deliberation, to find Holmes guilty of first-degree murder on November 3rd, 1895. At sentencing on November 30th, the judge condemned him to death by hanging. With the writing on the wall, Holmes began to confess, but in characteristic fashion, his confessions were a mix of truth and lies. Hearst newspapers paid Holmes $7,500 for his story, eager to print a sensational first-person account. In his paid confession, published in April 1896, Holmes claimed to have committed 27 murders across Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto, and even more attempted murders. Yet many of those he named, as noted, were still alive, or could not be verified. For instance, he said he killed an accomplice named Hedgepeth, but he had not. Marion Hedgepeth was alive in prison at that time, and other random people that the authorities knew nothing about. The document was filled with florid prose. Holmes at one point wrote, "I was born with the devil in me," asserting that he could not control his darker impulses. He also bizarrely claimed to be transforming into the devil, with his facial features supposedly changing in his cell, a piece of drama likely invented for effect. Essentially, Holmes used his final months to muddy the waters of history, making it difficult for researchers to separate facts from fiction in this account. It's widely held that Holmes was a pathological liar to the end. In one breath he would deny all charges, and in another he'd admit to heinous acts. While awaiting execution in Philadelphia, Holmes exhibited strange behaviour. He was notably calm and showed little remorse or fear. He became a model prisoner. Oddly enough, he took up pastimes like caring for a pet tame mouse and a pet chick that he hatched from an egg in his cell. He also converted to Catholicism, perhaps hedging his bets on the afterlife. He was baptized and given regular spiritual counsel by 2 Catholic priests, Fathers Daly and McPake. Some observers thought Holmes was attempting to play the part of a redeemed sinner, but many believed that this was just another act, an attempt to appear sympathetic or insane to avoid execution. Holmes's execution took place on May 7, 1896. That morning he ate a hearty breakfast and was by all accounts in excellent spirits. At about 10:10 a.m, he was led to the gallows inside the prison. Approximately 100 people were present to witness the hanging. It was semi-public by invitation. On the scaffold, Holmes was given a chance to speak. He briefly addressed the audience, denying any real guilt in the Pitezel murders, incredibly maintaining he had only ever killed by accident during medical procedures, referring to only 2 criminal operations, by which he meant abortions. He said, "I am guilty only of being an insurance fraudster, not a murderer," effectively denying his earlier confession. The final lie did not delay the proceedings for long. Holmes's last quip, when the executioner fumbled with the noose, was chillingly casual. "Take your time, old man. I'm in no hurry," he joked. At 10:13 a.m, the trapdoor was sprung by Sheriff Clement. Holmes dropped and the rope went taut. Contrary to some reports that his neck did not break, contemporary medical witnesses said Holmes's neck was broken by the fall. However, his body did exhibit notable twitching and convulsions for nearly 15 minutes before he was officially pronounced dead. Observers found this gruesomely fitting, a slow death for a man who had inflicted slow agony on others. By 10:25 a.m, H. Holmes was declared dead at age 34. Holmes had one final request that spoke to his macabre life. He asked that his coffin be filled with cement and buried extra deep, 10 feet down, because he feared grave robbers might steal his body for dissection. It's a dark irony that this notorious body snatcher and seller of cadavers was terrified of becoming a cadaver himself, but his wish was granted. After the execution, no autopsy was performed. Holmes' lawyer objected to it. One odd footnote: decades after his death, rumours emerged that Holmes had somehow faked his execution and escaped, given his penchant for trickery. This was pure conspiracy theory, but gained some traction in fringe discussions. To lay it to rest, in 2017, researchers obtained permission to exhume Holmes' body from Holy Cross Cemetery. Because of the concrete encasement, Holmes' remains were remarkably well preserved. His clothing was intact, and even his trademark moustache was recognisable on the skull. Dental records positively identified the body as indeed Holmes. After over 120 years, Holmes had not managed one last escape from the noose. He was reburied, and thus the final chapter of H. Holmes' life closed with certainty.
Chicago quickly learned that death does not always mean silence. The building at 63rd and Wallace stood empty after Holmes's arrest. The windows were dark, the doors locked. Police posted outside to guard what had become both a crime scene and a spectacle. Inside, the air was stale. It was thick with soot, chemicals, and something else. Officers assigned to the night watch said that the place never felt still. It started with sounds. Soon, police began hearing knocking that was heavy and seemed deliberate. 3 raps, always in sequence, not from the door, but from within the walls. They checked time and time again in every room, on every floor, but always met face to face with nothing. Soon footsteps followed, slow ones, pacing above them, when the upper levels were clearly empty. A door slammed on the second floor while an officer stood below, keys in hand, staring up at the stairwell. Another reported a sudden cold spreading throughout a hallway that had been warm moments before. These strange happenings soon became official reports, logged incidents, and soon men in uniform whispered to each other that something was inside the building, and that something was not of this realm. It was only a matter of time until the Chicago press caught wind of what was happening, with the papers spreading the news. Some laughed, some speculated, yet a sneaking feeling that something mysterious plagued that horrible building persisted. Soon another event followed. Late one night in August of 1895, witnesses saw two figures enter the castle, and moments later, an explosion was heard, and soon flames engulfed the building itself. Yet despite witnesses to the figures, and law enforcement's best efforts at the time to determine the culprits, no one was ever charged. Some said it was accomplices trying to erase evidence. Yet, whatever the case may have been, the castle survived, but only barely. Its interior had been entirely gutted. Yet, even after the fire, creepy reports continued. Neighbors in nearby buildings spoke of noises from the ruins at night, lights flickering where no electricity remained, a sense of pressure when passing too close, like walking through a pocket of heavy air. Holmes was physically gone, yet someone or something seemed to still occupy what had been dubbed his murder castle. Years passed. The building was eventually torn down, brick by brick, erasing the notorious location from the skyline. In its place, the city built something ordinary instead, a post office. By then, most assumed the horror had finally been buried, but some secrets refused to eternally rest. Postal workers assigned to the Englewood location began telling similar stories. They spoke of the basement, where upon descending the steps, it felt as if one was stepping into a tomb, their lungs becoming filled with stale, dead air, of footsteps echoing behind them when no one was there, of doors slamming shut on their own. Machines malfunctioned repeatedly in specific areas, and lights flickered for no reason. Accompanying these happenings soon came a disturbing manifestation: screams. Sharp and loud disembodied screams, described the same way by different people who never spoke to each other, occasionally pierced the air. These happenings almost always seemed to occur within the basement of the post office. Some workers who heard them ran, some froze, and several never went back downstairs again. These occurrences became so frequent that over time, multiple employees refused to work alone below ground. Accompanying the screams, the postal workers soon also began reporting seeing full-bodied apparitions, yet again, typically centered around the basement. Witnesses described the same sensation after these encounters: confusion, dread, and the overwhelming certainty that they were not welcome. But among these shadowy figures was one that became more prominent than the others, with disturbing reports centered on its presence in particular. Workers soon spoke of a tall, menacing man in black, not a clear apparition, but more like a silhouette, but one that was darker than the surrounding darkness. This shadow man was often seen in one's peripheral vision and then would vanish when confronted. Yet its presence was accompanied by feelings of a pressure on one's chest, a tightening in the throat, and the overwhelming dread that one was in imminent danger. Many would come to believe that this was the spirit of Holmes himself. With this being said, there are possible explanations, of course. Old buildings make noise. Stress creates hallucinations. History influences perception. All of these are true. But the stories never stopped. They spanned decades, with new employees, new generations, but the same basement, the same kind of reports. This leads me to the question that, can a place designed for cruelty ever become neutral again? Holmes built his castle to confuse, isolate, and ultimately destroy. He engineered secrecy, silence, and control. If places absorb intention and trauma, if human suffering leaves an imprint, then the ground at 63rd and Wallace absorbed something profoundly evil. Could these events ever truly be forgotten? Or would it and could it still remain stained upon the land where the castle once sat? Holmes once wrote that he believed he was born evil with the devil in him. Whether that was a lie or a delusion no longer matters. What matters is this: men like Holmes do not simply kill people. They change the energy and history of places forever. And long after the walls fall, after the bricks are hauled away and the ground is repurposed, the echoes remain. Footsteps in an empty hall, a scream that stops too soon, a shadow that watches. The murder castle may be gone, but something, whether it's Holmes himself, his victims, or another much more ancient and evil entity, seems to still lurk upon the land where the walls once held such horrific acts and trauma. Something that is watching and waiting to take a soul like a thief in the night. Thank you guys so much for watching this collaboration episode between me and the Tape Library, who I know a ton of you also watch, myself included, and please subscribe to both of us if you haven't already. Like this video and any of our videos that you enjoy. That always helps us a ton in the algorithm. And please leave your thoughts and comments below. Besides watching any of my videos, you can further support my work here on the channel by subscribing to my Patreon, which gives you access on the second tier and onward to all my content ad-free, and that's at patreon.com/mysteryarchives, or by purchasing any of my 4 books, which are the Stories from the Archive series, or any of my merch, which now includes some pretty cool art dioramas, wire-wrapped pendants, shirts, and more at mysteryarchives.myshopify.com. I appreciate you all as always. And we're starting off 2026 with a bang, so hope you liked this one. I'll see you again soon with another brand new video. This has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Stay safe out there from monsters like H.H. Holmes and other creepy things that lurk in the shadows. And take care. I'll see you next time.